I can't forget the exact moment I stopped being a child. I was 12 years old, standing in the communal washroom of Sublevel 19 in Hive Primus, staring at my reflection in a tarnished metal mirror that someone had managed to keep polished despite the scarcity of cleaning supplies. My face was thin. We were all thin in the lower hives, with dark eyes that my mother said reminded her of my father, though he died in the refinery fires before I was old enough to remember him. The water from the tap ran cold and rust-colored, carrying the metallic taste that I'd learned to ignore years before. Steam from the communal showers mixed with the ever-present smell of unwashed bodies and chemical sanitizer, creating a humid fog that clung to everything. Then my reflection changed. It wasn't gradual. One moment I was looking at my 12-year-old face, and the next I was witnessing something else entirely. That same face, but older, perhaps 30, screaming in agony as something invisible tore through my mind from the inside out. My eyes were bleeding. My nose was bleeding. My ears were bleeding. My mouth was open in a scream that I could somehow hear despite the absence of sound. A shriek of pure psychic agony as my consciousness was shredded by forces I couldn't comprehend. The vision lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds I experienced my own death with such visceral clarity that I vomited into the wash basin, hands shaking, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. When I looked up again, my reflection showed only a terrified 12-year-old boy with vomit on his chin. That was when the other visions began. My name was Calum Dross, and I was born on Mordian, a world locked in perpetual darkness, orbiting so close to its dying sun that one side burned while the other froze, with only a narrow twilight belt where humanity could survive. My mother, Velena, worked in the textile manufactories, stitching uniforms for the guard regiments that Mordian provided to the Imperium in numbers that seemed endless. We lived in a HAB unit that measured 8 square meters, shared a communal kitchen with 40 other families, and survived on rations that were 90% corpse starch and 10% whatever nutrients the administration determined were minimally necessary to prevent workforce collapse. It wasn't a good life, but it was life, and I'd never known anything different. The psychic awakening, because that's what the black ships would later call it, manifested over the following weeks. At first, I thought I was going insane. I would look at people and see flashes, my mother collapsing at her workstation, heart giving out from decades of overwork, 4 years, 2 months, 17 days from that moment. The supervisor who occasionally slipped me extra rations, bleeding out on the manufactory floor after a loom malfunction severed his femoral artery, 6 months, 3 days. The boy my age who lived 2 units down, his body broken and discarded in an alley after the wrong gang caught him in the wrong territory. 2 weeks, 5 days, 11 hours. I tried to tell my mother. She thought I was having nightmares from malnutrition and traded her own rations for mine until I was eating more than her, which only hastened the death I'd already seen coming. I tried to warn the supervisor to be careful around the looms. He laughed and told me I had a good heart but worried too much. When he died exactly as I'd foreseen, I stopped trying to warn people, because I'd learned the terrible truth. Nothing changed. The future I witnessed wasn't possibility, it was certainty. The universe had already written their deaths, and I was simply being shown the script before the actors played their parts. The black ships came when I was 13. I'd known they were coming because I'd looked at myself again, just a glimpse accidentally, in another polished surface, and seen a different death than the one I'd witnessed before. Or rather, the same death but preceded by years of service wearing the collar and robes of a sanctioned Psyker. The vision had terrified me more than the death itself. I would survive the soul binding. Most didn't. Most died screaming as the Emperor's will burned through their minds, cauterizing their connection to the warp into something controllable. But I would survive, and the decades following would be worse than death. When the Psykers in their ornate armor and ceremonial robes came to our sector, conducting their tests with devices that hummed with psychic resonance, I didn't try to hide. What would have been the point? They tested 300 children from our HAB levels. 17 showed latent psychic potential. I was among them. My mother wept as they took me. I looked at her and saw her death again. Clearer now, more detailed, and knew I would never see her alive again. She would die in 14 months, alone in our HAB unit, worked to exhaustion, her heart simply stopping during a rare sleep cycle. No one would find her for 3 days. The administratum would reclaim the HAB unit and assign it to another family within a week. She would become a statistic, a notation in death records that no one would ever read. I wanted to tell her I loved her. Instead, I said, "It'll be fine," because what else could I say? "I've seen your death, and there's nothing either of us can do about it." The black ship was called the Persistence of Sorrow, and it held 2,000 Psykers in various stages of processing. Most were children like me, torn from families and shipped toward Terra and the Emperor's judgment. The journey took 9 months through the warp, and during that time I saw the deaths of everyone aboard who wasn't already dead inside. The ship's captain, Void Kraken attack in 7 years, his body crushed in his command throne as tentacles breached the hull. The lead Psyker handler, assassinated by a death cult in 12 years, poison in his recaf. My fellow prisoners, most died during the soul binding. I saw their deaths before we even arrived at Terra, minds burning away, bodies convulsing, screaming until their throats tore. Some would survive the binding, but die shortly after, unable to adapt to their new existence. A handful would live long enough to serve. I learned not to look at faces. I learned to keep my eyes down, to focus on the floor, to avoid reflections. But you can't avoid everyone. The ship was crowded, and sometimes you had no choice but to see. If this glimpse into this peculiar damnation already weighs on your heart, honor this curse. Leave a comment with the word "witnessed" and subscribe so this story endures. The soul-binding chamber on Terra was carved from a single piece of obsidian, polished so perfectly that every surface reflected your image back at you 1,000 times. I kept my eyes closed for as long as I could, but eventually they forced them open, held my head steady, and made me look at the golden throne's distant psychic presence channeled through ancient machinery and sanctified crystals. The Emperor's will felt like staring into the heart of a star. It burned through my mind with surgical precision, finding every connection to the warp and cauterizing it, reshaping it, binding it under layers of psychic shielding and conditioning that would prevent demonic possession. The pain was absolute. I screamed until my voice was gone, until blood vessels burst in my eyes, until every nerve in my body was firing signals of pure agony. And through it all, I saw deaths. The tech priest operating the machinery crushed under a fallen statue in 18 years during a cathedral collapse. The attending priest, murdered by his own acolyte in 9 years over a theological dispute. The other Psykers being bound alongside me. Most would die within minutes. I watched them die in vision while simultaneously watching them die in reality, a double exposure of horror that nearly shattered what remained of my sanity. When it ended, when I somehow, impossibly survived, I was blind for 3 days. When my vision returned, it was changed. Everything had a slight shimmer now, a psychic afterimage that overlaid physical reality. And every person I saw their death. Every single person. The medicae who treated me after the binding, suicide in 4 years, unable to cope with what he'd witnessed during his service. The administratum clerk who processed my assignment, heart attack in 11 years while sitting at his desk, dead before his body hit the floor. The drill sergeant who would train me in combat applications, torn apart by Tyranids in 2 years during a failed planetary defense. I was assigned to the 117th Mordian Iron Guard as an attached Psyker specialist. My duties would include divination, psychic communication, and combat support. My handler, a commissar named Dathan Crove, met me at the transport station. He was a hard man with a scarred face and eyes that had seen too much. When I looked at him, I saw his death. Bolter round through the chest in 3 years, 2 months, 8 days. Killed by a traitor guardsman during a chaos incursion. "Can you divine enemy positions?" he asked, his voice rough from years of shouting orders. "Yes, sir," I said, though I wanted to say, "I can divine everything except how to make it stop." "Can you shield mines from psychic attack?" "Yes, sir." "Can you follow orders without hesitation?" I looked at him, at his death playing out in my mind's eye. The betrayal and pain on his face as someone he trusted pulled the trigger and said, "Yes, sir." He nodded. "Then you'll do. Welcome to the 117th. Try not to get possessed." The irony was that possession was the one thing I didn't fear. I'd seen my death. Possession wasn't part of it. The first deployment came 6 weeks after my assignment to the 117th. We were sent to Varanus IV, an agri-world that had stopped sending tithes. The official reports suggested equipment failure and communication breakdown. The reality, which I knew the moment we entered orbit, was worse. The entire planet had been infiltrated by a Genestealer cult, and we were dropping directly into an ambush. I saw the deaths before we even left the transport ship. Sergeant Holland, torn apart by hybrid claws in 3 hours, intestines spilling onto blood-soaked soil. Private Telvern, shot in the back by a corrupted PDF trooper in 5 hours, dying slowly from internal bleeding. Corporal Mavic, head crushed under a Patriarch's talon in 7 hours, brain matter scattered across a grain silo's interior. There were 47 soldiers in my immediate unit. I saw 31 deaths before we made planetfall. The other 16 would die later, in other battles, in other ways, but they would all die. Everyone died. The only variable was when. Commissar Crove noticed my distraction during the briefing. "Psyker Vross, pay attention." "Yes, sir." I focused on his voice rather than his face, trying not to see the bolter round that would eventually kill him. "Your primary task is to identify cultist concentrations through divination. Secondary task is to protect command personnel from psychic attack. Tertiary task is to not explode and kill everyone around you." Questions? "No, sir." "Good. Don't make me shoot you." He meant it as dark humor, the kind that guardsmen used to cope with the certainty of violent death. But I'd already seen he wouldn't die by execution. He'd die believing someone he trusted, screaming denial even as the round punched through his chest. The drop was textbook until it wasn't. We deployed via Valkyrie transports, spreading across the primary agricultural zone where cult activity was suspected. The landing was smooth. The ambush was immediate. They came from the grain fields like a wave of corrupted flesh, humans twisted into hybrid abominations, their bodies wrong in ways that defied anatomy, their minds broadcasting psychic hunger that made my skull ache. I raised my force staff, a weapon that channeled psychic energy through blessed materials, and released a burst of telekinetic force that threw back the first wave. Sergeant Holland was beside me, lasgun barking staccato rhythm as he fired into the mass of bodies. I didn't want to look at him. I didn't want to see his death again, overlaid on his living face like a grotesque double exposure. But in combat, you can't afford not to look at your allies. 3 hours from now, he would be screaming as hybrid claws tore through his flak armor, pulling out handfuls of organs while he was still alive enough to feel it. 3 hours from now, he would be begging for the Emperor's mercy. That wouldn't come. 3 hours from now, his last thoughts would be of his wife on Mordian, a woman I'd never met, but whose face I could somehow see in the reflection of his dying moments, a widow who didn't know she was a widow yet. "Vross! Left flank!" Crove's voice cut through my horror. I redirected, channeling psychic energy toward a cluster of cultists attempting to flank our position. The warp energy burned through my carefully constructed mental shields, tore through my consciousness like fire through paper, and manifested as a psychic shockwave that liquefied their brains inside their skulls. They dropped, blood running from every orifice, bodies twitching as their nervous systems died. I felt nothing. After months of watching deaths before they happened, actual death had become just another event. Something that happened because the universe had already decided it would happen. The battle lasted 18 hours. We secured the landing zone, established a defensive perimeter, and waited for reinforcement. Of the 47 soldiers in my unit, 31 died exactly as I'd foreseen. Sergeant Holland lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes, 14 minutes longer than my vision had shown, but the manner of death was identical. Private Telvern took 5 hours and 3 minutes. Corporal Mavic took 7 hours and 47 minutes. The variations were minor. The outcomes were inevitable. When it was over, when we'd counted our dead and burned the bodies, standard procedure on Genstealer worlds to prevent biomass reclamation, Commissar Crove found me sitting alone in what remained of a grain silo, staring at my hands. "First combat?" he asked, though he had to know it wasn't. "No, sir. You did well. Killed more cultists than half the squad combined." "Yes, sir." He sat beside me, which surprised me. Commissars didn't usually sit with enlisted personnel. "The deaths affect you." It wasn't a question. I looked at him, couldn't help it, and saw his death again. 3 years, 2 months, 8 days. Bolt around through the chest, fired by someone he trusted. The betrayal would hurt worse than the physical wound. He would die confused, unable to understand why someone he'd served beside would turn traitor. "I see everyone's death," I said, because what did it matter if he knew? The moment I look at someone, I see how and when they'll die. I saw Sergeant Holland die 3 hours before it happened. I saw Private Telvern. I saw Corporal Mavic. I saw all of them. Crove was silent for a long moment. Then, "Can you see mine?" "Yes, sir." "Are you going to tell me? Would you want to know?" Another silence. Then, "No. No, I don't think I would." He stood, brushing dust from his uniform. "Carry on, Psyker Vross. And Vross, everyone dies. At least you know they don't die wondering." He left me alone with 30, 1 new deaths added to my internal catalogue. 31 faces whose final moments I'd witnessed twice, once in vision, once in reality, and the knowledge that I had years more of this ahead of me. As these soldiers fell into darkness, if you feel the weight of their fate, press, like so others may learn what foresight truly costs. The campaigns blurred together after Varenus I-4, Talarnai V, desert warfare against Traitor Guard. 47 deaths I'd foreseen, including Lieutenant Marcos dying from dehydration after his water recycler failed, his body mummifying in the burning sand within 6 hours. Calth Secundus, Boyd combat support attached to Navy armsmen during boarding actions. 23 deaths I'd witnessed before the first breaching charge detonated, including Chief Bosun Harron, whose head would be taken off by an autocannon round in hour 3 of the assault. Cronus, urban combat in ruined hive cities against Orc incursion. 94 deaths across multiple engagements, including a young guardsman named Petrus, whose own grenade would malfunction and detonate in his hand, shredding him into fragments too small to recover. After 3 years, I'd catalogued approximately 3,000 deaths. 3,000 faces whose ends I'd witnessed before they happened. 3,000 futures that played out exactly as I'd seen, with variations measured in minutes rather than outcomes. I learned to stop trying to save them. I learned to stop trying to warn them. I learned to simply record their deaths in my mind and move forward, because the alternative was madness. But madness was creeping in anyway. It started with the dreams, though calling them dreams suggests they weren't real. Every time I slept, I experienced the deaths again, all of them, simultaneously. A psychic echo chamber where 3,000 people died over and over in the theater of my unconscious mind, and I was forced to witness every moment from every angle, feeling their fear and pain and confusion as the universe ended them according to its predetermined schedule. I stopped sleeping when I could. Stimulants helped, guard-issue chemicals that kept you alert for days, at the cost of eventual collapse. When I did sleep, I kept it brief, measured in minutes rather than hours, waking myself before the death dreams could fully manifest. Commissar Crove noticed. He always noticed. "You look like death, Vross." "Yes, sir. I looked like death because I saw death constantly, because death was my entire existence, because I was a living obituary for everyone I met. Medical says you're using stimulants beyond regulation limits. Medical is correct, sir. That'll kill you. I almost laughed. No, sir, it won't. He studied me, and I saw his death again. Closer, now, 2 years and 4 months away. The traitor's face was clearer in my visions now. A young guardsman named Corvin, who would be corrupted by chaos during a campaign I hadn't experienced yet. Corvin would turn his weapon on Crove in a moment of demonic possession, and Crove would die believing until the last second that Corvin could be saved. "You know how you're going to die," Crove said. It wasn't a question anymore. "Yes, sir." "When?" I calculated quickly. "Based on current projections, approximately 7 years from now. The method is unpleasant. They all are." He pulled out a flask, not alcohol, but some kind of medicinal tonic that officers were permitted for stress management. He took a drink, grimaced, and offered it to me. I shook my head. "Can you change it?" "No, sir. I've tried. With others. Nothing changes." "Then why look?" "I can't not look, sir. When I see someone, I see their death. It's not voluntary. It's just what I see now." Crow nodded slowly, processing this. Then, "That's the worst power I've ever heard of. You have my sympathy, Vross, for whatever that's worth. Thank you, sir." He left, and I sat alone, thinking about sympathy, and whether it meant anything when the sympathizer would die screaming with a hole in his chest in 2 years and 4 months. Year 7 brought the campaign that would define the rest of my existence. We were deployed to Gast Prime, a cemetery world where the Imperium buried its honored dead. 10 billion graves spread across a planet whose surface was more memorial than soil, where the Adeptus Ministorum maintained cathedrals dedicated to remembering those who'd fallen in the Emperor's name. It was meant to be sacred ground, protected, peaceful. Then the dead began rising. Not all of them. Even chaos doesn't have the power to animate 10 billion corpses simultaneously. But enough. Millions of corpses, pulled from their graves by warp sorcery, inhabited by daemons or animated by corrupted sorcerers whose names were forbidden to speak. The dead walked, and they hungered, and they turned the world of peace into a nightmare of undeath. I saw deaths I'd never imagined possible. Guardsmen killed by their own great-grandparents, risen as mindless corpses with strength beyond what their decayed muscles should possess. Officers, torn apart by swarms of skeletal children, small hands with impossible strength ripping through armor and flesh. Tech priests consumed by mechanical corpses whose augmetics had become weapons wielded by demonic intelligence. And I saw my own death, clearer than ever before. 7 months from the initial deployment, during an assault on a corrupted cathedral. Something would break through my psychic shields, something vast and terrible that existed in the warp rather than reality. It would pour into my mind like molten iron, burning away my sanity and consciousness, shredding my identity until nothing remained but screaming meat. The physical death would take 3 minutes. The psychic death would be instantaneous and absolute. I had 7 months to live. I looked at my reflection one morning, couldn't help it. The hab unit had mirrors, and saw myself in 7 months, older, haggard, screaming as blood poured from every orifice on my face. My eyes were bleeding, my nose was bleeding, my ears were bleeding, my mouth was open in a shriek of pure psychic agony as something invisible tore through my mind from the inside out. Just like the vision I'd had at 12 years old. The prophecy was completing itself. The circle was closing. Everything I'd experienced since my awakening had been leading to this moment, to this campaign, to this death. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt something like relief, because at least it would end. At least the catalogue of deaths would stop expanding. At least I wouldn't have to witness any more futures that I couldn't change, wouldn't have to carry any more faces in my memory, wouldn't have to watch the universe's cruelest preview reel for another 50 years. 7 months. I could survive 7 months. The moment of damnation has arrived. If you believe anyone deserves better than this, show it. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from today. The campaign on Ghast Prime was brutal in ways that conventional warfare couldn't match. The dead didn't fear. They didn't retreat. They didn't require supply lines or rest periods. They simply came, wave after wave, and we killed them until our ammunition ran low, then killed them with bayonets and entrenching tools and fists when the ammunition ran out. I used my psychic abilities with increasing recklessness. What did it matter if I'd burned through my reserves? What did it matter if each manifestation left me weaker, more vulnerable to warp incursion? I had 7 months. I had a countdown clock in my head, measuring out the days and hours until my annihilation. Commissar Crove pulled me aside after I'd collapsed during a particularly intense engagement, blood running from my nose and ears, a sign of psychic overextension. "You're going to burn yourself out," he said. "Yes, sir. In 7 months." His expression darkened. "You've seen when you die." "Yes, sir." 7 months. This campaign. A cathedral assault. Something breaks through my shields and destroys me from the inside. "Can you prevent it?" "No, sir. Nothing changes. It's already written." He was quiet for a long time. We were sitting in the ruins of what had once been a memorial garden, surrounded by shattered statues and broken gravestones. The smell of decay was constant on Ghast Prime. Not the sharp stench of recent death, but the thick, musty odor of old graves and corpse dust. "I've served for 20 years, Crove finally said. "I've lost count of how many soldiers I've watched die. But I've never had to watch someone count down to their own death. I've been counting down since I was 12, sir. That's no way to live. It's the only way I know." He looked at me, really looked at me. And for once, I didn't see his death. I saw genuine concern, which somehow hurt worse than indifference would have. "For what it's worth, Vross, you've been a good soldier. Better than most. You've saved lives, even if you couldn't save them all. Thank you, sir. And Vross, when it happens, when you die, I'll make sure it's recorded properly. You won't be forgotten." I wanted to tell him that everyone is forgotten eventually, that the Imperium grinds trillions of lives into dust and remembers none of them, that being recorded in some administrative file wouldn't change anything. But instead, I just nodded and thanked him, because he was trying to offer comfort, and I didn't have it in me to take that away from him. Especially since he'd be dead himself in less than 2 years, betrayed by a traitor he trusted. The months crawled by with agonizing slowness. 6 months remaining. 5 months. 4. 3. I catalogued more deaths. 2,000 additional faces. 2,000 additional futures. 2,000 additional entries in my mental obituary. The numbers stopped meaning anything. They were just data points. Statistics, proof that the universe was consuming lives at a rate that made individual existence meaningless. Commissar Crove died at the 4-month mark. It wasn't supposed to happen yet. According to my visions, he had nearly 2 years remaining. But futures can be flexible in their details. The broad strokes remain constant, but minor elements shift. The traitor guardsman who would eventually kill him, a young man named Corvin, was corrupted early during a warp storm that manifested over Ghast Prime. I saw it happen, watched Corvin's face change as something else looked out through his eyes, watched him raise his bolter, watched Commissar Crove turn toward him with confusion rather than fear, because he trusted Corvin, believed in him, thought he could be saved. The bolter round punched through Crove's chest exactly as I'd foreseen months ago. He looked down at the hole, looked up at Corvin, and said, "Why?" Blood pooling beneath his body while Corvin, or whatever was wearing Corvin's face, laughed with a voice that hurt to hear. I killed Corvin 3 seconds later, channeling psychic energy through my force staff and burning out his corrupted mind. He dropped, smoke rising from his eye sockets, the daemon that had possessed him shrieking back into the warp. But Crove was still dead. I knelt beside his body, closed his eyes, and added him to my catalogue. Face number 5247. Death witnessed twice, once in vision, once in reality. Another entry in the ledger of inevitability. The new commissar who replaced him was a woman named... Actually, I should specify, I never saw female deaths. My visions only showed male deaths. I don't know why. Perhaps it was a quirk of my particular psychic manifestation. Or perhaps the universe had decided that witnessing only half of all deaths was a sufficient curse. Regardless, when Commissar Thera arrived to replace Crove, I looked at her and saw nothing. No death. No future. Just a person existing in the present. It should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like another loss. One more person whose story I couldn't predict, couldn't prepare for, couldn't fit into my understanding of how the universe worked. 3 months remained until my death. The final assault began 2 weeks before my scheduled annihilation. Intelligence had identified the source of the necromantic corruption. A cathedral complex in what had once been Gast Prime's primary memorial district. A chaos sorcerer, identity unknown, power level extreme, had established a ritual site within the cathedral's deepest crypts, using the concentrated death energy of billions of graves to fuel a summoning that would tear open a warp rift large enough to swallow the entire planet. We had to stop it, which meant I had to be there, using my psychic abilities to counter his sorcery while conventional forces disrupted the ritual. I knew I would die there. I'd known for 7 years. The approach took 4 days through territory so saturated with death energy that reality itself was becoming thin. The air tasted like copper and ash. Shadows moved independently of their sources. The temperature fluctuated randomly between freezing and burning. And the dead kept coming. Endless waves of corrupted corpses that we had to destroy before they could overwhelm us. I saw the deaths of everyone in the assault force. All 347 soldiers. Their faces played through my mind like a horrific slideshow. Burned, torn, crushed, possessed, consumed. Most would die in the initial assault. Some would make it into the cathedral before dying. A handful would survive the cathedral, only to die during the extraction. None of them knew. They joked, they prayed, they maintained their equipment with the steady professionalism of veterans who'd survived worse. And I watched them, counting down their remaining hours, unable to tell them that the universe had already decided their fate. This cycle has repeated for millennia. If you think it must end, let your engagement be the prayer the Emperor never answered. Like and subscribe. The cathedral was a monument to hubris, a structure so massive that it could be seen from orbit, 10 kilometers tall, built from black marble and blessed stone, with towers that pierced the cloud layer and crypts that descended deeper than most hives. It had been beautiful once, according to records. Now it was corrupted, its sacred geometry twisted into shapes that hurt to perceive, its blessed materials radiating malevolence that made my psychic senses scream. We breached the outer walls using melter charges, pouring into corridors where the dead waited in organized formations, not shambling corpses but militarily arranged undead, positioned with tactical intelligence that suggested the sorcerer was directing them personally. I'd memorized the route to the central crypt, not because I'd been given maps, but because I'd seen my death so many times that I knew every corridor, every turn, every room I would pass through before reaching the ritual chamber, where something would tear through my mind and end me. Private Davin died first, his head removed by a scythe-wielding corpse horror. Sergeant Kellis died second, pulled into a wall by spectral hands that reached through solid stone. Corporal Maris died third, possessed by a demon that burst his body apart from inside, showering us with blood and bone fragments. I kept moving forward because stopping would have changed nothing. The deaths would happen anyway. My death would happen anyway. The universe had written this script 7 years ago, and all we could do was perform our parts until the final curtain. The ritual chamber was exactly as I'd foreseen, vast, circular, with walls carved from bones and a floor that pulsed with corrupted energy. At the center stood the sorcerer, a figure in rotted robes whose face was hidden behind a mask of flayed skin. Around him, 12 circles of power glowed with sickly light, and in each circle stood a bound Psyker, their minds being drained to fuel the summoning. I recognized several of them. I'd served with some. I'd seen their deaths years ago. They died here, in these circles, their consciousness consumed to feed a ritual that would doom a planet. The sorcerer turned toward me, and when he spoke, his voice was wrong. Too many voices layered together, speaking in harmonics that shouldn't exist. "The Death Seer," he said. "The one who watches endings. Do you see your own ending, little prophet?" "Yes," I said, raising my force staff. "I've seen it for 7 years. And you came anyway. How delightfully futile." He raised his hands, and reality screamed. The warp energy that flooded the chamber was unlike anything I'd experienced. It wasn't just power. It was wrongness made manifest, physics breaking down, causality dissolving, time and space becoming suggestions rather than laws. My psychic shields shattered immediately, leaving my mind exposed to energies that would have destroyed most psychers instantly. But I'd been bound by the Emperor's will. I'd survived the soul binding that killed most candidates. My shields rebuilt themselves even as they broke, layer upon layer of psychic protection that the sorcerer tore through one after another, each breach bringing him closer to my consciousness. I fought back, channeling everything I had, every ounce of psychic power, every technique learned from years of desperate combat, every last shred of will, into a counter-assault that targeted not his shields, but the ritual itself. I couldn't kill him, but I could disrupt his working. Behind me, soldiers were dying. I heard their screams, felt their deaths echoing through the psychic plane. Sergeant Harron, torn apart by summoned horrors. Lieutenant Vex, immolated by warp fire. Captain Thoros, possessed and turned against his own men. All exactly as I'd foreseen. The sorcerer's assault reached my innermost shields, the last barrier between the warp and my consciousness. He pressed against it with power that felt infinite, crushing, inevitable. "You die here, prophet," he said. "You die knowing you changed nothing." He was right. But I'd known that for 7 years. My shields broke. The warp poured in. I did not die. This was wrong. This contradicted 7 years of visions. This violated the fundamental truth I'd built my entire existence around. Nothing changes. Futures are fixed. Death is inevitable. But I did not die. The warp energy that flooded my mind should have shredded my consciousness, should have burned away my identity and left nothing but screaming meat. Instead, something else happened. Something I still don't entirely understand. My power changed. The curse that had shown me deaths for 7 years suddenly inverted. Instead of seeing endings, I saw the exact moment I needed to act to prevent them. Not all deaths, I couldn't save everyone, but specific deaths at specific moments. The universe showed me intervention points, places where my actions could shift futures that had seemed fixed. I redirected the warp energy the sorcerer was channeling, not away from myself but through myself, using my consciousness as a conduit rather than a target. The energy burned. Emperor, how it burned, but it didn't destroy. It transformed. And in that transformation, I seized control of the ritual's power structure and reversed it. The bound psychers in the 12 circles, I saw how to free them. Which bonds to break, which protective sigils to activate, which psychic frequencies to channel. I acted without thought, pure instinct guided by visions that showed me success rather than failure. 7 psychers survived. 5 died, their deaths necessary to generate the counterforce required to collapse the ritual. I saw their deaths and chose them anyway because the alternative was everyone dying. The sorcerer realized too late what I'd done. He tried to redirect his power, tried to reassert control, but I was inside his working now, a virus in his code, breaking everything from within. The ritual collapsed inward, imploding rather than exploding, and the backlash tore through the sorcerer's defenses and unmade him, not just killing him, but erasing him, retroactively removing his existence from reality's pattern. He screamed as he was unmade. The sound echoed across psychic frequencies I hadn't known existed. Then silence. The ritual chamber's corrupted energy dissipated. The walls stopped pulsing. The floor became just stone again. Around me, 127 soldiers had survived from the initial assault force of 347. Exactly 220 had died, their bodies scattered throughout the cathedral, their deaths playing out precisely as I'd foreseen. Except mine. I stood in the center of the ritual chamber, alive, blood running from my nose and ears, but consciousness intact, mind whole despite being exposed to warp energies that should have destroyed me. Commissar Thera approached carefully, bolter raised but not aimed. Psyker Vross, are you? You. I don't know, I said honestly. I'm alive. That wasn't supposed to happen. You stopped the ritual. Yes. At what cost? I looked at her and still saw nothing. No death, no future, just a person existing. Then I looked at the surviving soldiers and saw something new. Not just their deaths, but the moments before. The choices that would lead to those deaths. The intervention points where outcomes could shift. I can see differently now, I said. Not just endings. Alternatives. Is that better or worse? I thought about 7 years of watching inevitable deaths, 7 years of cataloging endings I couldn't prevent, 7 years of knowing that nothing I did would matter. Then I thought about what I'd just done, choosing 5 deaths to prevent hundreds, manipulating reality itself to change outcomes that had seemed fixed. I don't know yet, I said. As this nightmare reaches its conclusion, if any part of this moved you, give them the one thing they never had, recognition. Leave eternal in the comments. The afterwards is harder to describe than the before. I served another 3 years with the 117th Mordian, then was transferred to inquisitorial service when someone noticed my changed abilities. I worked for Ordo Malleus for 7 years, identifying intervention points in demon incursions and chaos corruption. I saw thousands more deaths, but now I also saw the places where I could prevent them. Not all of them, never all of them, but some. Some was better than none. I saved Sergeant Hallex from a sniper's bullet by ordering him to tie his boot 3 seconds before the shot would have hit. I saved Captain Veros from a Chaos Cult's assassination by having him take a different route to his quarters. I saved entire squads by identifying the exact moment to call for retreat, the precise instant to advance, the specific angle to direct fire. But I couldn't save everyone. Private Darren died because saving him would have meant 12 others dying instead. Lieutenant Kovacs died because the intervention point required resources I didn't have. Commissar Thera died. Finally, I saw her death, because saving her would have meant allowing a demon prince to breach reality. I became a chooser of deaths, a curator of endings, a psychic actuarial table calculating acceptable losses against saved lives. It's been 23 years since Gast Prime. I'm 35 years old, the exact age I was in my original death vision. I look at mirrors and see myself alive when I should be dead, a contradiction that existence has somehow accepted. My hair is gray despite my age, my face is lined with stress that goes deeper than skin, and my hands shake from psychic overextension that compounds with each use of my abilities. I've now catalogued approximately 10,000 deaths, 10,000 faces whose endings I witnessed, some inevitable, some prevented, all recorded in a mental ledger that grows heavier with each edition. I remember every one. Their names, their ages, how they died or how they would have died if I'd intervened differently. The dreams are worse now. Not just deaths, but the alternatives, the branching paths I didn't take, the people I chose not to save, the calculations that added up to acceptable losses. Every night is a lesson in moral mathematics, adding and subtracting lives to find the optimal outcome, knowing that optimal still means loss. I rarely sleep anymore. The stimulants help, though medical says they'll kill me within 5 years. I can see that death now. Heart failure in 4 years, 7 months. collapsing at my desk while reviewing casualty reports. It's preventable. I choose not to prevent it, because I'm tired. 23 years of being a living spoiler reel for the universe. 23 years of watching people walk toward fates I've already seen. 23 years of choosing who lives and who dies based on calculations that make sense mathematically, but destroy you ethically. The Inquisitor I serve, Lord Vector, asks me sometimes if I can see his death. I always tell him no. It's not true. I saw it years ago. A glorious death fighting a demon prince, buying time for evacuations that will save millions. But he doesn't need to know. Let him believe his future is unwritten. Let him have the mercy of uncertainty. Because I've learned the cruelest truth. Knowing the future doesn't grant control. It grants only the illusion of control, the false belief that seeing ahead means you can change things. But the universe is vast and cold and operates on scales that make individual actions meaningless. You can see 10,000 deaths and prevent 100, and those 100 will be replaced by others. New faces filling the same roles, the same scripts playing out with different actors. Nothing truly changes. You just trade which specific people die for other specific people dying. I look at my reflection now, and I don't see my death anymore. I see the deaths I've chosen, the faces I've catalogued, the weight of 23 years of moral calculation etched into lines and gray hair and eyes that have forgotten how to look away. Someone asked me once, a young Psyker, newly bound, struggling with emerging abilities, what it's like to see the future. I told them the truth. It's like being forced to watch the ending of every story before it begins. To know every punchline before the joke is told, to witness every tragedy before the first act, and then having to pretend you don't know. It's being the universe's cruelest spoiler, condemned to see how everything ends while being powerless to change the fundamental narrative. You learn to live with it, because the alternative is madness. You catalog the deaths, make your calculations, choose your interventions, and accept that you're just delaying the inevitable rather than preventing it. The young Psyker asked if it gets easier. I lied and said yes. I'm 35 years old, and I have witnessed approximately 10,000 deaths across 23 years of service. I have seen endings and occasionally changed them. I have chosen who lives and who dies, based on mathematics that makes sense only when you stop thinking of people as people and start thinking of them as numbers in an equation. I remember the exact moment I stopped being a child, 12 years old, staring at my reflection, seeing my own death and vomiting into a wash basin. That death didn't happen. The universe changed its script, or I changed it, or the script was never as fixed as I believed. I don't know which, and I'm not sure it matters. What matters is that I'm still here, still cataloging, still witnessing, still choosing. A new guardsman joined my detail yesterday, young, maybe 19, fresh from training. I looked at him and saw his death, torn apart by tyrannid bioforms in 3 years during the defense of Calf. I saw the intervention point. A moment 2 years and 11 months from now when I could order him to take cover 3 seconds earlier than instinct would dictate. Those 3 seconds would save him from the initial assault, and he'd survive to die of old age 47 years later. 3 seconds. That's the difference between dying at 22 and dying at 69. I'll remember to give that order when the time comes. I'll add him to the list of saved deaths, the smaller ledger that makes the larger catalogue bearable. And I'll try not to think about who will die in his place, because someone always dies in their place. Because the universe has quotas to fill, and death doesn't care whose face it wears. A young guardsman asked me if I had any advice for surviving. I looked at him, at his death, at his salvation, at the 47 years I could give him with 3 seconds of intervention. And I said, follow orders. Trust your training. The Emperor protects. Lies. All of it. But comfortable lies. The kind that let people sleep at night. I don't sleep at night. I catalog deaths and calculate intervention points and try to remember that the faces in my ledger were people, not numbers. I try to remember my mother's face. She died 22 years ago, exactly as I foresaw, and find that the memory has faded into death statistics and casualty reports. I try to remember what it felt like to be human before I became a living obituary, and realize I can't distinguish between the person I was and the function I've become. This is what 23 years as a Death Seer does. It transforms you from witness to curator to component. You become part of the machine that processes lives into deaths, into statistics, another cog in the Imperium's endless grind, notable only for the specific method by which you contribute to the grinding. The stimulants will kill me in 4 years and 7 months. I could prevent it. I won't, because I've catalogued 10,000 deaths, and I'm tired of being the universe's spoiler reel, and someday, eventually, everyone's story has to end. Even mine, especially mine. Now you understand what foresight truly costs. If you dare witness more truths, subscribe. The Emperor protects, but he never asked if we wanted to know the ending. I remember the exact temperature when they came for me, 40 to 1 degrees Celsius. I remember my mother's tears. I remember thinking the black ships might be mercy compared to what I'd seen in my reflection. I was wrong. This was worse. Because death would have been an ending. This is continuation, endless, exhaustive, consuming. This is being forced to witness every ending while denied your own. This is the curse disguised as a gift, the power that damns through knowledge, the future that exists only to demonstrate how powerless you are to change it. I am Caleb Ross. I am 35 years old. I am a sanctioned Psyker whose power shows him death, everyone's death, at every moment, forever. I have witnessed 10,000 endings and prevented perhaps 100. The mathematics suggest this is success. The faces in my memory suggest otherwise. New conscripts arrive tomorrow. I'll look at them and see their deaths. I'll calculate intervention points and acceptable losses. I'll choose who to save and who to let die. I'll add them to my catalog. This is what I do. This is what I am. This is forever. Or at least until the stimulants stop my heart in 4 years and 7 months. The Emperor protects, but he never asked what we needed protection from. And he never warned us that sometimes the cruelest power is simply knowing what comes next. The young guardsman is laughing with his squadmates, unaware that I've already seen his death and his salvation. Unaware that his life hinges on 3 seconds of intervention, 2 years and 11 months from now. Unaware that he's already an entry in my catalogue, a face in my mental obituary, a story whose ending I know before it begins. He asks me what it's like, being a Psyker. I tell him it's service. Just service. Like everything else in the Imperium. Another lie. But a necessary one. Because the truth, that I'm a living spoiler for the universe's cruelest stories, that I know how everyone's tale ends, that I'm powerless to change the fundamental narrative, would break him. Better to let him believe the lie. Better to let him walk toward his future unaware that I've already witnessed it, catalogued it, calculated the intervention that will save him. Better to let him have the mercy of uncertainty. I look at my reflection one final time and see not death, but continuation. Years more of cataloguing, witnessing, choosing. The vision that showed me dying at 35 was wrong, or it was right, but the ending changed. Or it was always meant to show me this instead. Alive but hollowed out, functional but not human. A component in the machine that processes lives into deaths. This is worse than dying. This is being forced to live while everything human is slowly stripped away, replaced by calculation and catalogue and the cold mathematics of acceptable loss. This is the curse. This is forever. This is what it means to see the future. Not power, not knowledge, not control. Just an endless reel of endings you're forced to witness, prohibited from preventing, condemned to remember. The Emperor protects, but from this there is no protection. Only witness, only catalogue, only the eternal weight of knowing how every story ends.